Establishment of colonialism. The scramble for and partition of Africa. Before 1800 AD, Africa and its interior were not known to the outside world. The interior of the African continent was exposed to the European world after the work of explorers, traders and missionaries. Europeans took interest in Africa's strategic areas with fertile land, minerals, navigable rivers and many more areas that they could easily exploit. Reports of the existence of snow-capped mountains in the interior of Africa and the inhumane slave trade activities also attracted great interest in the continent. By the 1880s, many European capitalist nations rushed and grabbed parts of the African continent claiming that they were their areas of influence. The act of rushing and grabbing parts of Africa's land and occupying them to the extent of nearly fighting among each other is called scramble. Partition is the act of dividing a large area into small parts or portions. So, partitioning of Africa meant dividing the continent among the imperialist powers. European capitalist powers partitioned the African continent among themselves during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 under the chairmanship of the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, without involving the Africans. Causes of the scramble for Africa. The scramble for and partition of Africa which occurred in the 1880s was due to economic, political and social factors that faced most of the European nations at that time. Economic factors. The scramble for and partition of Africa was inevitable because in the 1880s, European nations faced an economic transition from industrial production through competitive capitalism to that of monopoly capitalism. The monopoly capitalism discouraged the state-controlled economy and encouraged a free trade system. In addition, monopoly capitalism encouraged the export of capital in place of export of commodities produced in European industries. Thus, monopoly capitalism led to the formation of international associations which had the intention of dividing the world among themselves. However, the monopoly capitalist system did not have a smooth road, since its development created a lot of problems for the European economy. Major economic problems were the need for raw materials, markets, cheap labor and areas for investments. The demand for raw materials to feed their industries was sharp and competitive in Europe. Therefore, industries stimulated the need for controlling the source of raw materials such as rubber, cotton, sisal, cocoa, tea, tobacco, minerals and animal products such as skins, hooves and ivory. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, rubber was required for the manufacture of tires, while cotton was needed by the textile factories. Figure 1.1a Cotton Farm in Mwanza. See the figure from Oxford History Book 3. During the 1880s, Europe was in great need of cheap laborers since this period encountered working-class resistance through various working-class movements and trade unions. The workers in their working-class movements demanded better wages and good working conditions. However, the workers' demands could not be met easily by the monopoly capitalists who only focused on maximizing profits through exploiting workers. Thus, the only alternative that could offset the problem of getting cheap labor to the capitalists was to seek colonies in Africa. European capitalists saw that less profit was realized through trade and industrial activities in the 19th century. Therefore, they decided to invest surplus capital abroad in order to accumulate more profit. Capital N. Mediterranean Sea. High Atlas Mountains. Sahara Desert. Ahagar Mountains. Lake Chad. Niger River. Lake Volta. Ethiopian Highlands. Lake Turkana. AM Kenya. MT Kilimanjaro. Indian Lake Victoria. Atlantic Olduvai Gorge. Lake Tanganyika. Lake Nyasa. Ocean Kalahari Desert. Range R. Madagascar. Key. Figure 1.2a Map of Africa showing some rivers, lakes and mountains. Political factors. The major political factors were the balance of power and nationalism in Europe. After the Russian-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, European powers agreed among themselves that there should not be any expansion of territories within Europe. This decision aroused interest among European nations to look for other territories abroad. For instance, Russia expanded to Central Asia while other European nations such as Britain, France and Germany expanded their territories in the African continent, Asia and Latin America. European powers had a view that having many colonies is a sign of greatness and prestige for a nation. Thus, the nation's might and power was determined by the number of colonies the nation possessed overseas. For instance, France was defeated by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 and made her lose Alsace and Lorraine, which were very potential for her economy. France directed all her attention overseas, Africa and Caribbean. Such an attitude was demonstrated by other European powers like Germany, Britain and Italy, who joined the race of accumulating colonies as a sign of prestige. Similarly, Italy and Germany were young nations, so they wanted to prove their maturity following their unification in 1870. Social factors. There were several social reasons that stimulated the demand for colonies by European powers. Some of them were superiority complex and public opinion. The most pressing social factor was the mass unemployment that prevailed in many European countries. This was caused by the Industrial Revolution, whereby machines replaced human labor. As a result, many workers became jobless and led a miserable life. By 1870, there were about 1 million unemployed people in England only. The case of unemployment also affected other European countries like Germany, France and Italy. Therefore, colonies were the only solution to the problem, as they would offer settlement to the unemployed population from Europe. Europeans believed that their culture was much superior to others in the world. Hence they wanted to impose their domination to other races overseas in order to civilize them. For example, Cecil Rhodes, an Englishman, claimed that the British were the first and best race in the world, thus they had an obligation of civilizing the world. Furthermore, influential individuals in Europe encouraged the creation of overseas empires and settlements. Among such individuals were the British writer W.T. Stead, Harry Johnston, William Mackinnon, David Livingstone and Karl Peters. Other factors that motivated European powers to come to Africa were humanitarian factors. These were mainly encouraged by the Christian revival spirit in the 19th century that advocated for spreading Christianity to all communities in the world. This encouraged many missionaries to volunteer spreading Western civilization such as Christianity and Western medicine to the African continent, which could replace the African local worships, medicines and other traditions. From the 18th century, European leaders were forced to listen to public opinion if they hoped to remain in power due to the influence of the media. A majority of Europeans during this time were in favor of acquisition of colonies. For instance, in 1882, the French Assembly approved de Brazza's treaty with Chief Makoko of Congo. Areas in Africa that experienced intensive scramble. The scramble for and partition of Africa was not a uniform process in the whole continent of Africa. European powers scrambled for strategic areas such as the Nile, Niger and Congo basins, as well as Egypt, East Africa and South Africa. The reasons behind the intensive scramble for these areas were due to economic potential such as fertile agricultural land, minerals, rivers, and animal products such as ivory and skins they possessed in comparison with other areas in Africa by the 19th century. Therefore, all major European powers were interested in them and wished to take control of those areas. Niger crisis. This crisis involved two major imperial powers, namely the British and the French. Each nation controlled part of the Niger River and wanted to control the trade activities that prevailed on the delta of the river and its banks. The rivalry between the two imperial nations created suspicion that if one of the two nations would control the potential areas in the interior, and control the trading activities, it would limit the other access of controlling these potential economic areas. Thus, the two powers found themselves in the crisis of scrambling for the Niger River and its delta. Egypt and Nile crisis. This crisis was associated with the controlling of the Suez Canal in Egypt between the French and the British. France was the first European nation to have contact and relations with Egypt since 1798. During the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt claiming that he was saving her from the Mamluk Beys from Turkey. However, France wanted to take control of Egypt's wealth and defeated the British influence in Egypt. France's intention of controlling Egypt stimulated the British desire to control the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal in Egypt was a strategic area to the British, because it was the shortest route to India and the Far East, which were potential British investment areas. The British and the French used the Sultan of Turkey to overthrow Khedive Ismail, the Egyptian ruler, in 1879, so as to have full control of Egypt. However, the task of taking control of Egypt was achieved by the British alone. France had political problems at home and had a task of suppressing rebellions in Tunisia at the same time. By 1882, the British managed to take full control of Egypt. This situation angered the French. They moved south of Egypt in order to change the course of the Nile River and turn Egypt into a desert, since Egypt depended on the Nile River for its survival. To restore the life of the Egyptians and its economy, the British went ahead of the French southwards to Uganda in 1894, where they claimed Kenya in 1895 and Sudan in 1898 as her areas of influence so as to prevent the French from blocking the water from going to Egypt. This is what sometimes is referred to as the Egyptian question. Congo crisis. The Congo area was earlier claimed to be under the British and the Portuguese influence. However, the French, after losing Egypt to the British in 1882, diverted their attention and interest to West Africa and Congo. The French occupied Porto Novo, followed by other European powers like Germany that claimed Togo, Cameroon, Tanganyika and Southwest Africa, Namibia, to be their areas of influence. King Leopold II was the ruler of Belgium from 1865 to 1909. He wished to establish a personal empire. This was after seeing powerful European nations like Britain and France had managed to accumulate wealth and prestige from the colonies they had occupied. In 1876, King Leopold II formed the International African Association IAA. Its members were from various European nations. It was claimed that the major purpose of this association was to abolish slave trade and introduce free trade and open up research centers in Africa. Furthermore, King Leopold II sent several expeditions. Among them was Henry Morton Stanley, who in 1879 managed to explore River Congo. Stanley reported that River Congo had potentials for commerce in Central and Western Africa. Moreover, Stanley established contacts between the coast and the Stanley Falls. Later on, he created an Empire of Congo in 1884. Thus, King Leopold II was able to acquire rubber from Congo. King Leopold's activities in the Congo state distressed the Portuguese, who claimed to have been the first to have contacts with Congo and even declared Congo as their area of influence. The British approved and recognized the Portuguese claims over Congo, but the French disapproved them. France also desired control over the Congo as its area of influence after having lost Egypt to the British. The French through de Brazza therefore signed treaties with Chief Makoko of Congo. These treaties placed his territory under French control. The British and the Portuguese were also interested in claiming areas of influence the same area of Congo. Hence, intensified rivalries in the region that were about to cause war among these European nations in Africa. East Africa crisis. The scramble and partition of East Africa was motivated by commercial competition among Europeans, missionary activities in Uganda, and the role of Karl Peters. There was a commercial competition between the British and the German consul to win the Sultan of Zanzibar so as to develop trade and communication with the mainland. Moreover, the British wanted to control the mainland so as to prevent Uganda and Kenya from being under the control of other European powers, and also wanted to safeguard her Indian colony, which was a source of her industrial raw materials. On the other hand, Germany was interested in making Tanganyika her colony so as to protect the French missionaries in Uganda. King Leopold II wanted to develop trade routes from the east coast to the interior up to Congo. The French and the British wanted to offer protection and support to their missionaries in Uganda who were threatened by Kabaka Mutesa and the Muslims. On the other hand, Karl Peters, a German colonial agent, managed to sign bogus treaties with some present-day Tanzania mainland chiefs on behalf of Germany without consulting the Sultan of Zanzibar. A good example of such bogus treaties was the agreement made between Karl Peters and Chief Mangungo of Mzawero near Kilasa, which was written in the German language. The treaty agreement reads as follows in English language. Mangungo, Chief of Mzawero in Usagara, and Dr. Karl Peters. Mangungo simultaneously for all his people and Dr. Karl Peters for all his present and future associates hereby concluded a treaty of eternal friendship. Mangungo offers all his territory with all its civil appurtenances to Dr. Karl Peters, as the representative of the Society for German Colonization, for the exclusive and universal utilization for German colonization. Dr. Karl Peters, in the name of the Society, declares his willingness to take over the territory of the Chief Mangungo with all rights for German colonization subject to any existing suzerainty of Mwini Sagara. In pursuance thereof, Chief Mangungo hereby cedes all the territory of Mzawero belonging to him by inheritance or otherwise for all time, to Dr. Karl Peters, making over to him at the same time all rights. Dr. Karl Peters, in the name of the Society, undertakes to give special attention to Mzawero when colonizing Usagara. This treaty has been communicated to the chief Mangungo by the interpreter Ramzan in a clear manner and has been signed by both sides, with the observation of the formalities valid in Usagara, the chief on divest enquiry having declared that he was not in any way dependent upon the chief of Zanzibar and that he did not even know of the existence of the letter. This contract has been executed legally and made valid for all times before a great number of witnesses. We testify herewith. Kwajia Kinga, Mark, Chief Mangungo's son of Galila, Mark, Chief Mangungo's second son of Draman, Mark, Gareth Feel Augustado, Mark, of the interpreter Ramzan etc., Dr. Kasrul Julk, Mzawero Usagara November 29, 1884. It was quite unclear whether Chief Mangungo really knew the content of this treaty, since that he could not read or write German or Kiswahili languages. For instance, the agreement signed by Chief Mangungo, though translated into Kiswahili, the content was different from that written in the German language. Moreover, the interpreter used in translating the agreement between Karl Peters and Chief Mangungo translated the agreement on the interest of Karl Peters because he was a member of his expedition. He represented the capitalists' interests. In addition, some African chiefs signed bogus treaties under threats and forceful conditions and not through their own consent. For example, Chief Mangungo of Mzawero signed the treaty document while surrounded by a hired military army of Karl Peters. Thus, it was not easy to refuse signing the document. Later on, the Germans presented this signed agreement between Mangungo of Mzawero on behalf of his people and Karl Peters on behalf of German society before other capitalist powers to claim an area of influence in the interior of East Africa. South Africa crisis. South Africa experienced a scramble from the Dutch and the British. Though the Dutch were the first to settle at the Cape from 1652 and later moved to the interior and settled in the Orange Free State and Transvaal, the British came later and colonized the Cape and Natal provinces. The British and the Boers competed for diamonds in Kimberley and gold in Witwatersrand. The competition led into the Anglo-Boer War of 1880 to 1881 and the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902 respectively. However, diplomacy was used both parties, the British and the Boers, and the war came to an end. The process of scramble and partition of the rest of Africa. There were two main stages of scramble and partition of Africa. The first stage, that of signing treaties between European powers and the African chiefs, under the umbrella of providing protection. In reality, the Europeans were creating access to controlling trade, exploiting the natural resources and other activities that prevail in the areas they claimed as their spheres of influence. The second stage was through the Berlin Conference, which was held in Berlin under the chairmanship of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany. Bismarck called the International Conference of European Nations who had areas of influence in Africa from November 1884 to February 1885. However, in some areas European powers had more treaties on dividing colonies among themselves. For instance, in West Africa between the 1880s and the 1890s the British signed many treaties with West African chiefs of the present-day Ghana, Yoruba states, Oil River and Oba of Benin as well as Nigeria. The British also signed protection treaties with all the kings of Asante in 1891. The French managed to sign treaties with some chiefs of West African states. Among them were Chief Amadou Sikou of Tukulur Empire and Samori Touré of the Mandinka Empire. Finally, the French managed to control the coastal area of Papo and Porto Novo in 1833. While Germans took control of the coastal areas of Togo and Cameroon by June 1884. Activity 1.1. 1. Topic to debate. The treaty governing the Nile waters to be renegotiated. 2. Dramatize signing a treaty between Europeans and African traditional leaders. 3. Discuss factors that led to the scramble for and partition of Africa. Revision exercise 1.1. Section A. Write true or false against the following statements. 1. Karl Peters signed treaties with the chiefs of Usagara, Olugiru and Ukami for the German country. 2. Military conquest was used by the British to suppress the Shona and the Ndebele in Mozambique. 3. The Portuguese used force to establish their rule in Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. Section B. Answer the following questions. 1. Identify 3 methods used by the Europeans in acquiring colonies in Africa. 2. Identify 4 economic factors that led to the scramble for colonies in Africa. 3. Why was the Suez Canal very strategic to the British? 4. Why was the Zanzibar Sultan not involved in the 1890 Anglo-German Agreement? 5. What was the impact of the Scramble for and Partition of Africa on African societies? Give 6 impacts. 6. Discuss the 3 major factors which led to the partition of Africa among the imperialist powers. 7. Define the following terms. Scramble. Section C. Fill in the blanks provided. 1. The strategic areas in Africa that made European powers to scramble were B, C, D, E. Was the Belgium ruler from 1865 to 1909 who took interest in acquiring colonies in Africa. Signed treaties with the French in West Africa through 2. 3. Chief. Brazza. 4. After losing Egypt to the British in 1882, the French diverted their attention and interest to Anne. 5. One of the bogus treaties signed by African chiefs was the treaty signed by and Karl Peters of the Germans. 11. B. Partition.